And we got an amazing portion this Shabbos. Phew, it is chock-a-blocker, filled with all different details. Let's start with the summary. I think if everyone can mute, let me mute everybody. And if anyone wants to say anything, you'll unmute yourself, but I'm muting everybody. Okay, so let's start as we always do with a summary. I haven't got all the details of the portion in place because it is just too many things. There's so many commandments in this week's Parsha. So I've highlighted most of the known ones. There's a general theme, and the theme is Tikun Olam, how to fix a world, how to fix a broken world. So it deals with a lot of things that relate to interpersonal relationships, it relates to not being cruel to animals. There are a lot of different diverse laws that speak about how we ought to make the world a better place. So starting from the beginning, it speaks about war. Teitzei means when you go out. That's the name of this week's portion. The literal translation, when you go out, and it is when you go out to war. And it talks about, in its opening paragraph, a situation where a soldier wants to marry one of the captives. And there are numerous laws that relate to such a situation to dissuade the Jewish soldier from getting involved in the heat of the moment and wanting to now change his destiny, change the rest of his life. And therefore, he goes through a whole lot of procedures to make sure that he is not infatuated with this woman and that he comes to his senses, that he is not making a decision for life in a moment of passion in war.
Yeah.
Then it moves on to the second situation. Is it talks about a son who gets a double inheritance, that the laws of inheritance mean that the oldest firstborn son will get a double inheritance over and above the inheritance of his siblings. And then it speaks about something that the Gemara actually says never ever happened. A ben sorer umoreh is a son who's a wayward, excessively rebellious son. The Gemara goes to discuss how bad the son is. He is irredeemable, and he is in fact sentenced to death because of all of the terrible activities that would happen in his life if he was left to carry on. He's just not controllable at all. But the Gemara goes to great lengths to say that it never actually happened. This is one of those laws in the Torah that was meant to be a deterrent rather than a response. No child was put to death by this law. The laws contain a lot of details. For example, based on the specific wording of the verses, it says that the mother and the father have to speak with the same voice. Very, very intricate details relating to how this law was impossible to actually fulfill. But by the way, we can get a lot of other insights into raising children, because very often a child begins to rebel because parents don't speak with one voice. The father says one thing, the mother says something else. The kid knows exactly who to go to for what. For kindness, he goes to the mother. For guilt, for money, he goes to his father. And the parents don't speak in one voice. That's one of many, many details which made it impossible to actually execute this son. But it's put into the Torah to be a deterrent that it should never actually come about. I see I have a spelling mistake over here. Then it speaks about the speedy burial of a deceased. We've said a number of times that the Torah says things counterintuitively in an area, in a space, which you would least expect it to mention the law. Where do we know the law that all of us practice today? A very, very critical law when it comes to funerals is that we have to bury preferably on the same day. It's a big mitzvah to bury on the actual day that a person passes away and not to leave overnight. In Yerushalayim, I was astonished when I first saw it. They bury at night, even at 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock in the middle of the night. They don't want to allow any person who has to be buried to be left overnight. In Yerushalayim, they don't do it at all. But outside of Yerushalayim, we wait sometimes for children who might be overseas so that it can be of respect and honor to the deceased that the children can be at the funeral. So we do wait sometimes up to 3 days. Sometimes family complain that why don't we wait 4 days? Because it'll be even another child is coming or somebody's finishing their holiday, depending on what the family's issues are. But in the Beis Din over here, they're not allowed to go beyond 3 days. But the real ideal situation is that a person should be respected and should be brought to burial immediately. Where do we learn that law about? We learn it about a situation where somebody was put to death by Beis Din. What kind of person? A person who deserved to be put to death, which was a very, very rare situation. A Beis Din that executed somebody once in 70 years was considered a murderous Beis Din. It was totally unnatural. But that person who was deserving to be put to death should not be left overnight. Rashi says that we should be careful that a person represents Hashem. We are made in the image of Hashem. And when a person is left to be hanged, we should not leave that person overnight. The person should be brought to burial as soon as possible. From there we learn that if that relates to somebody who was put to death, for sure it should relate to somebody who in fact is a regular human being and not deserving of any punishment. That a person should be brought to burial right away. We'll come back to that point in our insights. And then it continues to talk about returning a lost object. We have a whole section that I want to talk about. I said there's a lost sheep story, so we're going to come back to that. That it's a big responsibility if you find something to announce it and to return it to the owner. Then it speaks about another thing that relates to animals, and that is that if an animal had fallen under its burden, so it was now suffering under the weight of its burden that had caused it to collapse, then you should help the owner of that ox or that animal, that mule, to lift the animal and to restore the animal so that it's not suffering. So that's another aspect of Tikun Olam. Then it changes to something completely different, which is crust dressing, something that's probably pretty in the news today, because we don't talk about cross dressing because people can decide if they are men or if they are women. It's a personal persuasion. But the Torah says that there is a man and there is a woman, and they have different modes of dressing, and a man should not dress like a woman. It could be putting on a dress, but it also could be adorning himself and putting on the things that a woman would adorn herself with that are inappropriate for a man. Still staying on the theme of Tikun Olam, of making sure that the world is fixed, it says that if you're to take away the chicks or the eggs of a bird, you should chase away the mother bird first so that you do not take it away in front of the mother bird. There's a great argument between the rabbis, the Rishonim, going back 800-900 years, as to whether this is a compassion issue or not. The Gemara actually says it's not. You should not say it's only compassion for the mother bird not to watch as her eggs are taken away. But in actual fact, the commentaries derive that it actually has a lot to do with the compassion. With you can take the eggs and the chicks, but leave the mother bird to fly away so that she can produce others. Don't destroy, like we said last week, the tree with the fruit. Take the fruit, but don't take the tree with it. Then it's still speaking about safety in this world. You have to build a safety fence around a flat-roofed home. Wherever somebody might be walking, in South Africa, the manifestation of that could be a swimming pool. Wherever somebody could, God forbid, fall in and come to harm, it is the responsibility of the owner of the property to put a fence around their roof, if that's where people are walking, or any high place, or any place that a person could fall and come to harm. Then it speaks about a number of different mixed elements in this world. We spoke about cross-dressing before. Men should know they're men and women should know they're women. It also speaks about that relating to seeds. You're not allowed to graft or sow together different types of seeds to grow alongside one another. For example, you have a vineyard and you start growing wheat in your vineyard so that you actually have the soil being drawn from by two distinctly different types of produce. So that is not allowed in terms of mixing. One should keep distinct the different kinds. So we do apply that in law today, that one shouldn't do grafting between different fruits, but it doesn't apply to eating them. So you're allowed to eat a nectarine, but you shouldn't actively be the one to create the nectarine. There's such a thing as a peach, there's such a thing as a plum. Don't mix. And staying on that theme, see that we got an American spelling over here, that when you plow with animals, you should not use two different types of animals and pair them up to pull the plow. For example, an ox, and then you have a mule. They go at different speeds, they have different strengths, and they will cause each other harm because they want to draw the plow at different speeds. And being forced to stand alongside one another causes them harm. So you should be careful, again, in a law that relates to animals. Staying on the theme of mixing, you should not mix the garment that is made, oh my goodness, sorry, please don't look at the spelling this week. This was done away from our office. The wool and linen, which are two different types of threads, thread that is grown from the ground and thread that is taken from the wool of a sheep. You should not mix them together. It's called shatnez, and that applies even today. There are laboratories that test suits to see whether they are a mixture of linen and wool. This happens less today, but it's still something that has to be part of our concern. Even in the clothing we wear, there's something called kosher, what is appropriate as a garment and not. Then it teaches us the law of tzitzit, which is what we put at the end of our four-cornered garment. Then it speaks about hygiene in an army camp. There's interesting laws that, again, are taught to us in a place that is counterintuitive. A person is going out to war, he needs to attach to his satchel, in which he's probably carrying all the implements of war and survival. He has to attach a spade so that when he relieves himself, he should leave the place exactly as he found it. So that is taught to a person even in the hard situation of war. How much more so should we respect the world and ensure that we leave this world tidy and neat and as we found it, and not treat the world with disdain. Then it speaks about interest. You're not allowed to charge interest, you're not allowed to pay interest. The Jews were often pushed into a situation that they had to take interest, particularly from the non-Jews, which is not the law. This law specifically relates to your brothers, which means taking interest from a fellow Jew. It's a strange law because you're allowed to rent out an item, you're allowed to rent out your car and take money for the time that the person used your car, but the Torah says you're not allowed to do that when it comes to money. Because money has a tendency that there's interest on interest, and before you know it, the person is overwhelmed. But it relates specifically to lending money for interest to another Jew. In the Merchant of Venice, and whoever depicts the Jew as the money lender, it wasn't a profession of choice. It was generally a profession that Jews took up because they had very few other avenues to make a living. And there was a lot of anti-Semitism that surrounded that. Even as people excuse Shakespeare for reflecting on the reality of what was in society at the time, they actually weren't Jews in England at the time because they had already been expelled. So that's why some people complain about his portrayal of Shylock. Then it speaks about the laws of marriage and divorce and Yibum later on, which is the levirate marriage. How do you get married? In what case do you get divorced? How do you get divorced? God forbid. And what happens if a person dies without children? Then the brother of the deceased will take the late brother, the late husband's wife, as in marriage, and it'll be called the levirate marriage, something that is not performed nowadays, because generally one is not allowed to marry a brother's wife, even after the brother passed away. It's only in this situation where the person did not have children, and it is to perpetuate the name of the deceased brother or husband. There's an alternative method that it is undone today through the process of chalitza, which is a whole subject in its own right. Then it speaks about if you do make a loan, how do you take collateral? What do you take as collateral? If you have a poor person to whom you've made a loan, and the person has something by which that person makes a living, so he has a loom that he is weaving on, you cannot take that as collateral because that's the person's life sustenance. So you may not take something that is absolutely essential for that person's living. Also, you're not allowed to go into that person's house like a sheriff and attach property to the loan, because you have to respect that person's private place. Maybe the law can do that, but you cannot take the law into your own hands. Also, you shouldn't nag the person and make the person feel exceptionally uncomfortable. And if you take the person's blanket and the person needs it every night, then you must go and deliver it for the time that that person needs that item, such as a blanket, so that he's not cold at night while you're securing your loan. So compassion and sensitivity. Then it speaks about the fact that kidnapping is a capital offense. So the death sentence would be put into place if a person had kidnapped with warning and with all the situations in place. And that's why generally when we translate theft or robbery in the Ten Commandments, it's actually not its true translation, because in the Ten Commandments, where it's talking about things that have a capital punishment, it's a capital offense. So stealing is not, as we know, we have to restore the item that one stole. But in the Ten Commandments, it is a capital offense, because the type of stealing that it is in its literal sense is about stealing another human being, which is kidnapping. Then it speaks about, remember Miriam. Miriam was afflicted with a unique type of leprosy that was a spiritual attachment to it, and it was brought about when a person had spoken lashon hara, negative speech about somebody else, which Miriam had done against her brother, and she was sent out of the camp, and then she had to wait. We had the whole Bnei Yisrael waited for her for 7 days, because that's how great she was. The community, the whole congregation remained waiting for her to be healed. Then it speaks about accurate weights and measures. I always mention this in shul, that there are only 3 items in the whole Torah that not only are you not allowed to utilize, but you're not allowed to even have them in your home. What are the 3 things that you're not allowed to even have them in your home, even if you're not using them? The one is chametz on Pesach. So even if you're not eating chametz, you have to get rid of the chametz. So today we sell the chametz. You're not allowed to even own it, even if you're not using it. The second thing is, you're not allowed to have idols in your house, even if you're not using them, even if you're not bowing down to the idol. The mere fact that you have it in your home is an offense. And the third thing is weights and measures, which tells you how serious we are about honesty and about accuracy, that even if you're not using the scale, do not keep a scale in your house that has weights and measures that are not 100% scientifically correct. Somebody might land up using it and thereby cheating another human being. So weights and measures have to be 100% accurate. And then right at the end, it tells us the second thing to remember. The first thing in this week's Parshat says, remember Miriam. There are 6 things that we mention every day after davening that we need to remember. One of them is Miriam, and one of them is the last paragraph of this Shabbos, which is, remember the nation Amalek, Asher Karcha Baderech, that chanced upon you on the way, and they attempted to attack the stragglers and the weak of the Jewish people. These are the beginnings of terrorism, which attacks those who are vulnerable in the community rather than the soldiers. And so treacherous and so terrible were they that we were told, never have mercy on Amalek, because bad will come out of it. As King Saul subsequently did have mercy on the king of Amalek, and as a result of that, he lost his kingdom. And also as a result of that, we had the honor of the human being called Haman, who is a descendant of Amalek. And whilst we don't know who is exactly Amalek today, which nation it is, the tendencies of Amalek have been inherited by a number of people. But in its origin, when we knew who they were and when we had the right Beth Din, the nation of Amalek was not allowed to exist. That is, it's not all. It's very far from all. There are many, many commandments in this week's Parsha. That is a sampling of a lot of them. Let's move on to some of the details that it talks about in the Parsha itself. So, it says in the opening words, Ki Teitzei la milchama, when you go out to war against your enemy. But the Hebrew wording, which is important, is Ki Teitzei la milchama al oivecha, on your enemy. It doesn't say against your enemy. What does it mean to go out to war on your enemy? So there are a few things we can derive from this. First thing is that in order to have victory in the battles of life. And we could begin by talking about the simple meaning of this verse, which is when a soldier goes out to war, but it can be applied to the battles that every single one of us has every single day. The internal battles, the battle between our Yetzer Tov and Yetzer Hara. We're constantly on the battleground. So how does one overcome one's enemy? And sometimes the enemy seems formidable. So the first thing is you have to gain the higher ground. You cannot stoop and descend. That's the second point. Sorry, let's stay with this first point. You cannot imagine that you might lose. Because if you think you're going to lose, you'll lose. In a battle that needs to be won, you have to go out to battle with a sense and a feeling that I am a winner and I can win this battle. If you don't believe in yourself and you don't believe that you're going to succeed, you will fail. It'll be a self-fulfilled prophecy. The first thing in the battles of life is you have to believe in yourself and you have to believe that you have the strength to do it. And the verse is implying that by saying, Aloivecha, go out knowing that you are on, above, higher than your enemy. Your enemy doesn't stand a chance against you. And that's the only way you can win the battle. In Tanya, it speaks about the fact that sometimes in a wrestling match, a weaker person can win the match, the fight, against a formidable enemy that's a much stronger person. Because when we are despondent, or when we are lethargic, or when we are depressed, so then we don't go out to win our battles. We go out with a self-doubt. And when there's a self-doubt, we don't win the battle. So whilst it's talking about a soldier on the front, it's talking about you and me every single day. We have battles to fight. We have to believe in ourselves and believe in the battle that we want to win. Because we're in it to win it. And the second point that can be derived from this word on is that we've got to stand above the fray. It says that King Solomon once said that if you wrestle with somebody who is filled with mud and dirt, you will end up getting filled with mud and dirt. So don't stoop to the gutter to fight with the enemy. Don't utilize the same methods that they use. Sometimes the enemy uses very, very unsavory and inappropriate methods. Don't stoop to use the same methods to fight back, because you got to define yourself. You shouldn't be defined by your enemy. It shouldn't be, this is what he did, so therefore I'm also doing the same thing back. No. The person has to know, this is who I stand for, and this is my system of morality, and therefore, Aloivecha, stand higher than your enemy. Don't stoop to the level of your adversary. Then it speaks about, and you'll take captives. We said, what happens if the person finds a woman and he wants to actually marry this woman and take the captive? But just taking the literal sense of the word, you go out to battle and you will take captives. What's that telling us? In the war, maybe you take captives because you don't want those guys, the enemy, to regroup and then to fight a battle again tomorrow. So you capture the enemy so that you can subdue the enemy, as Israel has had to do many, many times. At the end of the Yom Kippur War, where it became the Arik Sharon turned around the whole war because he encircled the Egyptian army. So taking captives is a method in war. In terms of our own battles, which we're saying, these portions come just before Rosh Hashanah. We're preparing for Rosh Hashanah. We have battles that we need to fight in order to win and to go into Rosh Hashanah with a clarity of which way our life is heading. So when we go into war, then don't just aim to win. Take captives from the battle means learn something, earn something, develop something as a result of the battle. Don't just survive. You must leave somehow richer than you were when we went into the battle. If we're dealing with a war against COVID-19 today, we don't want to survive this only. I mean, right now we'll be happy to survive. We're thinking about how do we find the antidote to it, and then we'll be able to come out against the COVID. But ultimately, we don't want to just come out surviving, because we don't want to go through an ordeal of such a terrible battle that the world has had to fight, and then we land up being the same human being as we were before. V'shavisa shivyo means you'll take captive, take something, develop something out of yourself for this. For example, our minyan, which with such great joy began on Monday morning. It was the most, I can't tell you, olatz libi, my heart was dancing. I was so happy. And what happened was that not only the first minyan in 5 months, it was the first minyan ever that we had live. And at the same time, we had a separate group of people who were unable to come to shul, who were connected through Zoom. So the minyan was better than it's ever been before, because we learned something. So now we can include people who are unable to come to shul. That means you went through a battle and we came out with something that we didn't have before. But closer to home, it should mean that we don't come out of this and merely look at ourselves in the mirror and say, I'm the same person that went into COVID that came out. If this is a battle, I've got to come out stronger, I've got to come out more alive and more committed, more driven than I ever was before. And that is the whole story about the negative encounter that happened between Yaakov and the angel of Esav, which we know all the way back from the story of Breshit, where at the end of the whole battle through the night, Yaakov turns to Esav and the angel of Esav and says, give me a blessing. And the angel gives him the blessing and says that you will no longer have to only be called Jacob, but you'll be called Israel. And that's where the name came from. Kisarisem Elikim, because you strove even with angelical forces, and Tatuchal, and you were able to subdue and overcome the enemy. So we became, this princely name of Yisrael was derived from a battle. Why was Yaakov turning to the angel of Esav after he'd managed to ward him off the whole night and to win the battle? Why didn't he just say, go away, leave me alone. I won the battle. I don't want to ever see you again. No, he says, I want a blessing. Some blessing has to come out of the conflict that I had. I'm not fighting the whole night with all of the danger, all the vulnerability, all the terrible things that could happen, and I emerge out of it and I'm the same Yaakov. I want a bracha so that I can derive a blessing, something positive, from a negative situation. And every negative situation that we have to go and fight should lead to a growth, not just a survival. That is how we go into battle. We started speaking about this right at the beginning, that a person who is hanged should not be left overnight. We're told in the verse, because a hanged person is a curse to Hashem. And the Gemara in Sanhedrin, as Rashi quotes it, he says, man is created in the image of Hashem. And he gives an analogy of twin brothers. Imagine if there's twin brothers, one of them happens to be the pride of the community, and the other one a total renegade. And then the person who was deserving to be put to death, the twin brother deserving to be put to death, is hanged. And anybody who walks by sees, as they're seeing this hanged person, sees the image of the brother, who's the Rosh HaKol, who's maybe the most important person in the whole community. So it is a slight to the brother who has the exact same image because he's a twin. And then it looks like you are doing something to the brother. That's only an analogy that when, God forbid, a person is hanged, we have to remember that every person, even a person who is deserving of being put to death, was created in the image of Hashem. And if a person is treated with disdain, it reflects on an attitude to Hashem. God is, as it were, included in the disdain that is applied to another human being. So that teaches us something way beyond burial. It teaches us that the way we treat another human being could be indicative of our attitude to Hashem, or the way we treat another human being undermines Hashem. That's why the top of the right-hand side of the Ten Commandments is that I am the Lord your God, and on the top of the left-hand side it says, do not kill. Because man was created in the image of Hashem. And if one, God forbid, destroys a life, it says something about our relationship to Hashem, in whom that person's image was created. So we see a sensitivity to see another human being not just as another human being. We should look at it as another human being, as a son of Hashem. Even a person who is deserving to be put to death, how much more so a person who is your regular human being. And now we're going to get onto this whole subject of returning something. So, and there's quite a lot that I want to share on the subject of returning. So you're walking in the street and you find something, and you don't know who it belongs to. So the Torah goes to great lengths to explain that you need to establish who the owner of this item is. You need to announce it. You have to go to, there was actually a place in the city that people knew that people would go and cry out and call. Today it might be your JJCF announcement or some tweet that you're able to put out, but you have a responsibility to restore an item to somebody else. It's a care for somebody's property. It shows that you believe that Hashem is the master of this world, and it isn't just that you found that finders keepers. It's not finders keepers. Finders has a responsibility. In fact, you probably prefer not to have found the item because of how much trouble one has to go to in ensuring that you're able to return it. And just to share some of the stories that the Talmud tells us in that regard, it talks many stories, but it tells the story of Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa. Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa was once at home, and there were chickens that were left behind by his house, and they couldn't identify who the owner was. Nobody knew who they belonged to, and these chickens went on and they produced what chickens do. They produced eggs. So the wife said, okay, so let's maybe use the eggs. We could sell the eggs. He says, no. When the person comes, we got to restore the chickens and the eggs that the chickens produced. So then the eggs grew, hatched, and there were not new chickens. Now there was a big hawk that the guy was taking care of, feeding them, looking after these chickens. And eventually it was very hard to take care of so many chickens. He said, you know what, we'll sell the chickens, we'll buy goats. At any rate, the story carried on, and now suddenly there was a huge herd of goats. And one day some guy comes along and he says, you know what, I was here, it doesn't say how long ago, but let's say I was here 5 years ago, I was going by here and I lost a few chickens. Says Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa, good that you mention it. Come to my backyard, I'll show you. And he produced a whole herd of goats that he was able to bestow upon this person. So he went to a lot of trouble. There's a lot of laws that relate to lost items. If it's something that could go moldy or something that could get even like a book or a Torah, you need to air it out. You need to take action so that it doesn't get destroyed in your keep. You have to actually look after it. And whatever benefit is derived from it belongs to the original owner. So there's a tremendous responsibility of restoring a lost item. But let's apply it closer to home, because that's what we always say. We've got to take these things and bring it into our lives now before Rosh Hashanah. So the Holy Chofetz Chaim says on the verse, return them to your brother, referring to the items which we're about to learn about, different items that are mentioned in the Torah. Return them to your brother. Says the Chofetz Chaim, if this applies to property, how much more so to a lost soul, even 100 times. So if a person is lost in life, there's a person who's forgotten that he's a Yid. He doesn't know who he is, she is. So you have a responsibility, not only as a rabbi, but any one of us. Look at that person and say, my lost child, you're a child of Hashem, how can we bring you home? And even if you did that, and the person again broke loose and decided to behave inappropriately, don't say, I helped you once, now it's not my problem anymore. Just like with a lost item, Hashev teshivenu, you will return it means even 100 times over. And much more so when it comes to the person who hasn't lost an item, the person, him or herself, is lost. Do something. And that is why the Rebbe sent out people across the whole world and made that an important emphasis in Jewish life. That if there's a Jew on the other side of the world who's lost, I don't say it's not my problem. What's it got to do with me? It has to do with me. It's my brother. And therefore build a mikveh in Ankara and build a mikveh in South Korea, as they're just doing, and in Sweden, and build shuls and build schools, and not just for the community where everyone is because it's convenient and it helps people. Think about the person on the other side of the world, the child of Hashem who's lost. And then we have a responsibility to restore the lost item, the lost child, to Hashem. That is how important it is. And now I want to go a little bit further from the actual meaning of the verse and go through a beautiful concept, which is where we see what Hasidus can do with dry law, with technical law, and turn it into something that is so personal and relates to our very lives. So let's learn a piece of Gemara together. This Gemara is taken from the tractate of Baba Metzia, which is one of 3 tractates that talks about damages. And this middle, it's called the gate, Baba Basra, and Baba Metzia, and Baba Kama. So you have 3 different volumes that speak about loss and how to ensure there isn't going to be loss. It could be a commercial law where you're causing loss. It could be damages that you did to somebody. And then it speaks about, this middle gate talks mainly about lost and found. So on page 27a, it takes apart the verse that is in this week's portion that says that when you find something, you should restore it, as we said, even 100 times. And then it carries on and says, his ox, his donkey, his garment, his sheep, every lost thing of your brother. What's the obvious question on this verse? Anybody want to say? You can unmute yourself if you have an answer. What is the obvious question? You have to restore a lost item. His ox, his donkey, his garment, his sheep, and anything that you might find. Obvious question is, if you're going to end off with the word anything, anything includes everything. So why are you listing 4 specific items if you are then going to end off by saying that it applies to all items, not just to specific items? So why are these 4 specific items mentioned? So the Gemara goes into great detail to learn what the verse is telling us by listing each of these specific items. For example, it says, why does it say garment? Because a garment is identifiable by signs that the person will remember. This was my jacket, and there was a frayed edge on the side. It had a stain on the front right-hand side. This is what was wrong with the zipper, or in the pocket you'll find. So a garment has many identifiable features, and therefore we learn from the garment that how do you return a lost item? You don't go into the marketplace and say, who lost 1,000 rand? Because you might have 20 people claiming that they lost 1,000 rand. You got to be able to say, where did you, what are the signs? Give me signs. You wouldn't say I lost 1,000 rand. You'd say I found money. Then the person would say, yeah, I lost money. Well, how much did you lose? Where did you lose it? And the signs have to indicate that that person has a right to that property. Vitally important. Otherwise, you might be giving a lost item to the wrong person. Where do we learn this concept of signs and identifiable features, and that you go through the process of returning something by asking the person to give you signs? From garments, because garments are known to be rich with signs. They have many, many ways that people can recognize their own garment. You could have in 770, 5,000 people wearing a black hat, and you'll say, well, how in heaven's name will anybody know who their hat is? So somehow everybody knows who their hat is. This is where it got creased. This is where it got, I was in the rain. Garments have features. Second thing it says, what do we learn about a donkey? From a donkey we learn that the identifiable features are not only in the item itself, but if the donkey had a saddle, and the saddle had identifiable features, then the person can claim the donkey by identifying features of that which is attached to it, like things are attached to a donkey. What I learned from the ox? From the ox I learned that there were very valuable hairs that grew in the tail of an ox. I don't know if they used it for violin strings or whatever they did use it for, but it was valuable. So the person would say, I'll return the ox, but for the 6 months that it grew hair in my own, under my care and keep, I want to be able to be entitled to that. We say no. An ox comes to tell you, return the ox as it is, even though it had become more valuable in the interim because it had grown additional hair. And then the Gemara says, what about sheep? The Gemara attempts to say, well, sheep also. The sheep grew wool. So there's the wool that you have to leave on the sheep, or the value of it has to be returned to the owner as well. So the Gemara says, yeah, but you just said that. That we learned from ox. What do we need sheep for? Because you're learning the same thing, that whatever grew on the animal during the time that you were its custodian belongs to the actual owner, not to you. So the Gemara just ends off and says, Se kasha. It's problematic. And sometimes the Gemara is able to come to terms with the fact that we don't have an answer. But it ends up with those words, a sheep is difficult. That's all the Gemara on the literal translation of the verse. But now let's go into a beautiful thought process which Chassidut does, which says that in the same way as there's a body of the Torah, there's a soul of the Torah. Just like in a human being, there's a body of the human being, there's a soul. And there's an inner meaning in the most literal, obvious physical discussions of Torah that carry hidden messages that relate to the soul of the Torah. And perhaps when we're talking about return, and that's why I left the word return in the title of today's shir a bit ambiguous. You have an obligation to return the lost item, and if you are the lost item, you also need to return. So let's go out of the absolute simple meaning of the verse, and we're now just before Rosh Hashanah. A person discovers that they're lost. Somebody should help him return. And we ourselves should be ready to make the effort to return, to come home. That's what the season of Elul before Rosh Hashanah is all about. And there are 4 different types of animals that are listed because we ourselves are made up of many different types of animals. One of my teachers in yeshiva, whom I quote from often because he impacted on my life very largely when I arrived in yeshiva as a 16-year-old, Reb Mendel Futterfass, he often used to say, you are a zoo. We're all a zoo. We're all a walking zoo, a living zoo. Inside the zoo, there are lots of different animals. There's the carnivores, you go to the cat section. There's the herbivores, more timid type of animals. There's the snakes. All of these are indicative of a different part of our own zoo. Because we have all of these different tendencies and animalistic nature that we need to resolve inside of ourselves. And we need to bring ourselves home when we are lost in whatever type of manifestation, whatever animal seems to be predominant at that time. But it's good to know ourselves, because in ourselves we have all of these different elements of self that are identifiable with an animal, and we need to shape up and to fix ourselves in all of these different areas. So now let's learn this verse on a completely different level, on a more spiritual level. We're talking about not to the exclusion of the Gemara. That's the simple meaning. That is what the law is. But what could we learn from this? The soul of the Torah teaches us that we need to return. And when we come to return, the Torah says that you need to know that there is a thing called an ox, and there's a thing called a donkey, and there's a thing called a garment, and a thing called a sheep. And all of them represent 4 archetypical tendencies in a human being. The ox. The ox is the energetic, excited, enthusiastic, violent, the bull in a china shop, the one that causes damage because he's angry and he's constantly, his temperament is just so wild that it's impossible to bring himself back. So we say that even in a situation where you are hot-tempered and you do have anger and you have an ability to tread on other things and to gore and to cause harm, and that's where you're coming from, you are able to do teshuvah. You can return. Bring it home. You can utilize the energy of the brute energy of an ox for good. As we are told and often emphasized in Chassidus, that Rav Tavua B'Koyach Shor, there's tremendous amount of produce in the power of an ox. What does that mean? The guy's plowing his field and he's struggling to get the plow to go through the very arid earth. And then he looks up and to Allah Tzoros, in case things are not hard enough for himself, he sees there's a bull charging him. He's wearing red that day, right? So things are not looking so good that day. So the first thing he thinks is, I killed the bull. I have to get rid of the problem. We say no. The bull, if you can get a nose ring through the bull, if you can guide the brute energy of a bull, then you can attach the plow to the bull, and the bull can plow the field much faster than you can. So when there is a tendency in a human being to be that passionate and that uncontrolled and to act in the moment, impetuously, and without just all the energy that comes from the bull, if you're able to turn it around, it can be a tremendous assistance to the soul, to the service of Hashem. So the first example of lost is the person who's lost because we are brute, uncontrolled human beings. So know that is a state of mind or nature that God has given us, and that could be used for good as well. So bring it home. Bring the ox home. Make sure that the ox is also part of your service of Hashem. It could actually do good things. What's a harder thing to return? An ox is violent and wild. What is a mule? A mule is exactly the opposite. What do we say the characteristic of a mule is? A donkey? It's stubborn. It digs its feet in. It says, I'm not going. I'm not walking. I am not going to respond. I'm not going to do what you tell me to do. So stubbornness is another characteristic that we have that lives in our zoo. In our zoo of all these different animal tendencies, we have a tendency inside of ourselves that is stubborn and that does not want to comply. Which is worse? So if you look at the damage that could be caused, it could be that an ox is worse. An ox could be exceptionally dangerous. That's if you look at the danger that it can do. But in terms of what can you bring home easier, it's easier to rearrange and redirect the energy, the vibrant energy of a bull, than to get the donkey going. The donkey is stuck. It just doesn't want to budge. You can't. It's like a ship that is sailing in the wrong direction. You can turn the sails. You can bring the ship around. But when it's lost its sails, then it's much, much harder to get that ship moving. So when a person is so stuck in our ways, why don't I want to change? Why don't I want to develop? Because I've always done it this way. This is who I am. This is exactly what I am. I'm defined, and I can't change, and I can't move. This is who I am. And that's how I'm going into Rosh Hashanah, Chas v'Shalom. So the second example of an element that can be lost in ourselves is the animal that needs to be motivated, that needs to be energized, that needs to be woken up. Wake up and meet the day. Don't be apathetic and lazy and indifferent and cynical. All the tendencies that are similar to the mule who's unmoving and unbending and impossible to get going. So that's a worse situation, but return it. Realize that even you with that nature can return. You can overcome the stubbornness, and stubbornness can also be used for good. As often Moshe Rabbeinu referred to the Jewish people, Am Kashayoref, a stiff-necked people. We were stubborn people. We've been stubborn in our ability to not let go of Torah and of Hashem through the harshest, most difficult conditions. We stood by. So that even stubbornness, if it's applied in the right way, could be a positive thing. Then comes the third item. And the third item is clothing. Now the Hebrew word for clothing is actually a beged. What is a beged? It comes from the Hebrew word bagad, which is to misrepresent, to be a traitor. Why is clothing got anything to do with a traitor? Because what it means is that you can pull the wool over somebody else's eyes by dressing up differently to what you really are. That's the connection of Hebrew words. In English, we just have words, but in Hebrew, if you get to the roots of it, you can actually see the association of words. Beged means that you have clothing in which you can dress yourself and therefore misrepresent yourself. So this represents the realm in a human being that is lost much more than the ox and much more than the mule. This is a person who's so lost that he begins to self-justify. He begins to dress up, meaning misrepresent himself, is unable to see the faults because he covers them. So what chance do you have of coming home if you don't even know that there's a problem? You walking around as if you look like a king, but you're a pauper. You look like you're such an upright person, and yet deep inside is the person who's dishonest. That's what treachery means. You misrepresent who you are. And a beged has the capacity to do that. So you might think I'm so far gone that I have pulled the wool over my own eyes, not only over everyone else's eyes. I think I'm somebody who I'm not. I act like somebody who I'm not. I don't even have a hold on who I am. I don't know who I am. So even that person, come home, return the person. Return yourself. Don't give up and say that because I've been misguided and misrepresenting myself and convincing myself I'm somebody who I'm not all my life, that this isn't the Rosh Hashanah this year to address that and to turn it around. We can. And sometimes we even misrepresent ourselves appropriately. How does that mean? Sometimes we have to look like we're fulfilling the ambition of our Yetzer Hara. We're eating and we're drinking, we're doing the things that our Yetzer Hara wants to do, but we're actually misrepresenting ourselves to the Yetzer Hara, because our real intention is not to self-indulge, but to serve Hashem. A total turnaround in that sometimes we feign involvement in this world as if it were our personal indulgence, when it's actually for the sake of serving Hashem. But now comes the fourth item, which the Gemara, remember, said, the sheep. What does the sheep teach us? It doesn't teach us anything. We already learned it from the Yak. What does the sheep teach us? It says, the sheep is difficult. Se kasher. What is the most difficult animal to deal with? Ironically, because we would never have thought so, it's the sheep. Who's the sheep? The sheep is the follower. The sheep is always just where everyone wants it to be. The sheep is always pleasing everybody. You want me to do this? I'll do this. You want me to do that? I'll do that. How could you do such a thing? You're right. The sheep is the one who's constantly saying, I conform to whatever everyone around me is telling me because I follow. That's what the Shepsela does. And even though nobody has come to any harm, there's not been any danger, nobody's been destroyed, what are we concerned about? That if you want to return and you want to do tshuva, one of the most complicated things to extricate ourselves from is from a situation where we agree with everything, we answer to every call that we're ready to follow, but every moment we're following something else. We have no backbone, we don't stand for anything, we don't have a principle, we don't stand strong and firm because we're sheep. If we are, ultimately, the Jewish people have been compared to sheep. If we choose to be the sheep of Hashem or the flock of Moshe Rabbeinu, then we're following in the right direction. And then being a follower who's not smartly trying to work out different ways, but ready to submit ourselves to the will of Hashem, then a sheep could be a very good thing. But the tendency of a sheep that is not directed and not returned and not brought home to Hashem is a very dangerous situation. This is a person who's constantly saying, yes, I agree with you and I agree with you and I agree with you. I want to make you happy and I want to make you happy and make you happy. So there's no principle that you can even present to such a person. Because today they'll tell you, I'm with you. The rabbi will say, you need to do this and this. You're right, Rabbi. Yes, sir, 100%. And then the next second he meets somebody else and he's saying, he's the shepsel, he's just a sheep. So the most complicated, se kasha means the most dangerous thing is the sheep that is unable to face up to its own reality. I see that I have gone over my time, so I'm therefore going to leave it with the lost sheep that has to be found, with a commandment that we need to bring ourselves home, this Elul, in preparation for Rosh Hashanah, and the lost sheep could be me, and it could be you, and we've got to first and foremost know whether this season is the season of the ox or the season of the donkey. We've got to know which animal it is that we're presently dealing with. Don't treat the donkey like an ox, and don't treat the ox like a donkey. Don't mix the two up. So the first thing is to know which animal is being the strong tendency of my life at this particular moment. If you know who we are, if you know it's anger, then we can deal with anger. And if you know it's stubbornness, we can deal with stubbornness. If you know it's treachery, deal with treachery. And if you know that it is inappropriate compliance, then we can get our act together and start following the right things in life. I think that I've overstayed my time. The time went very quickly. My apologies. I didn't notice the time. Have a wonderful, wonderful week. This Shabbat,
Thank you,
the first Shabbat that we will be at Great Park on Shabbos morning, not on Friday night. And there's a booking system. If you so desire to come to Shul, please make sure you go through all the processes and procedures so that you're all safe. Have a wonderful week, everybody. God bless.
Thank you,
Rabbi.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. How do you switch this thing off, man?